open. Distinguished participants, I declare open Agenda Item 7, entitled Human Rights Situation in Palestine and Other Occupied Arab Territories. We will now proceed with the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Ms. Francesca Albanese to present her report. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, delegates, members of civil society and national human rights institutions, I'm honored to present my first report as Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967 to the Human Rights Council. Allow me to express my gratitude to the distinguished members of the Council for bestowing upon me this mandate that I undertake with unwavering dedication, rigor and impartiality. I chose to focus this report on arbitrary deprivation of liberty early in my tenure because of the gravity of this phenomenon in the occupied Palestinian territory. Since 1967, Israel has detained approximately 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territory, including tens of thousands of children. Currently, there are 5,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons, including 160 children, and 1,100 of them are detained without charge or trial. Let me be clear from the outset. I do not condone any acts of violence that the Palestinians might have committed or might commit while living under an unlawful occupation or in the pursuit to end it. However, we must acknowledge that most Palestinians have been convicted through a series of violations of international law, such as discrimination, persecution, and breaches of due process, and for ordinary acts of life in the exercise of legitimate rights. I found that widespread and systemic arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Palestinians is a structural component of the regime that Israel has imposed upon them. And let's look closer at this structure. The enforcement of deprivation of liberty of Palestinians in the occupied territory rests in the hand of the Israeli military, which writes, enforces and reviews martial laws that only applied to Palestinians. Israeli domestic laws, meanwhile, applies to Israeli settlers illegally residing therein. This dual legal system is the pillar of Israel's apartheid regime. The presence of the Palestinian Authority does not change this reality, nor does it alter Israel's obligation under international law. An intricate web of military orders, about 2,500 of them, an emergency regulation dating back to the British Mandate era, dictate offences enforced at the discretion of the Israeli military. I would like you to consider just some of the legal grounds that lead to Palestinians' arrest and detention. Political gatherings of more than 10 people, including processions or vigils, without a permit by the army, are criminalized with 10 years imprisonment. Entering military-declared restricted areas in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is subject to 7 to 10 years imprisonment. Having contacts with or possessing materials related to hostile organization is punishable with 10 years imprisonment. And let me be clear, all major Palestinian organizations, from political parties to charities and human rights organizations, are considered hostile. Membership in any group where other members commit specific offences is punishable by life imprisonment. This draconian legal regime, which is also vaguely drafted and confusing across military orders that overlap and contradict each other, lays the foundation of a coercive environment whereby Palestinians are constantly at risk of being imprisoned, often by carrying out the simple acts of life, from farming, fishing, going to school, but also opposing the occupation. The broad base to incarcerate Palestinians notwithstanding, Palestinians are routinely arrested and detained without charge or trial, often based on secret evidence and for an indefinite period of time, leaving them in a limbo of uncertainty. Administrative detention has become a tool to persecute Palestinians under occupation. Military courts, staffed by entirely military personnel, are the primary and often the only judicial avenue accessible to Palestinians. And in military courts, where rights to defense is simply not enforceable, Palestinians are presumed guilty, registering a steeply high conviction rate of 99% and forcing most of them to resort to plea bargain, confessing crimes that they have not committed. The very common unlawful deportation outside the occupied Palestinian territory, because 80% of Palestinian prisoners are detained against international law in Israel, triggers a domino effect of violations ranging from confinement in places where legal defense, legal counsel and families cannot access the detainee or the prisoners. While in Israeli custody, Palestinians are subject to all sorts of physical and psychological abuses, also often to illicit confessions. And some of these treatments might amount to torture and other cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment. Children liable to imprisonment since 12 years of age are treated as inhumanely and lawlessly as adults, forced to spend an average of 12.5 days in solitary confinement, and most of the detention without contact with families or lawyers. The prison experience leaves an indelible traumatic mark on them, breaking the spirit of future generations. Imprisonment trespasses Palestinian life. It is common practice for the Israeli forces to detain the bodies of Palestinians deceased in custody or killed during Israeli armed attacks. Most arrests take place within 1 kilometer from the 270 colonies that Israel has built for 750,000 Israelis in the occupied Palestinian territory, against one of the most foundational norms of international humanitarian law, and often during raids and incursions, often at the dead of night, to instill fear and to make sure, to quote Israeli soldiers, to make sure that their presence is felt. This is why I say it is the security of Israel's systematic appropriation of Palestinian land and dispossession of the Palestinian people that the longest occupation of modern history is meant to defend, not the security of Israel as a member of the family of the United Nations, which remains sacrosanct. The occupying power frames the Palestinians as a collective threat, ultimately de-civilianizing them, namely eroding their status as protected person under international law. On top of it, the individual and mass deprivation of liberty dovetails with a mass entrapment that captivates the Palestinians as a people in the occupied territory through physical, bureaucratic and digital confinement techniques, transforming the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole into a constantly surveilled open-air prison. Walls, checkpoints, alternative roads, segregated roads which fragment the territory into something that evokes the carceral archipelago of Okoldian memory. Bureaucratic barriers consisting of permits and prohibitions that regulate every instance of Palestinian life, from visiting family, deciding to travel abroad, choosing residence and cultivating, farming their land. Surveillance technologies that follow the Palestinians everywhere they are. This is what the Palestinians live under. This further restricts the Palestinians spatially and psychologically, creating a pervasive system of discipline, control and punishment to anyone who objects or who opposes this system. This large-scale carcerality is an essential feature of settler colonial regimes, which in history have crushed native populations while incrementally seizing their land. In this context, Palestinian authorities operate in captivity under Israel's omnipresent control and are not a state apparatus geared to defend or protect the Palestinians, as exemplified by the recent attacks by the Israeli army or heavily armed settlers in Nablus, Jenin, Jericho, Hawara, Masaferyatta, Turmusaya, Urif, Safa, and the Gaza Strip. Therefore, invoking both parties to calm down is misleading. Israel's unlawful carceral practices are tantamount to international crimes, as I documented in my report, which warrant an urgent investigation by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. All the more as these offences appear to be part of a plan to de-Palestinianize the territory. This threatens the existence of the Palestinians as a people, as a national cohesive group. It is critical that the international community recognizes the illegality of Israel's occupation, naturally leading to apartheid. This cannot be rectified, this cannot be made more humane by merely addressing some of its most severe consequences. It is to be brought to an end and restore the rule of law and justice. And I ask you, I urge you, to follow up on this recommendation in the interest of both the Palestinians and the Israelis. Thank you.
Thank you. According to our practice, we will start by hearing from the delegations of the countries concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel. You have 5 minutes. I note that the delegation of Israel is not present in the room. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine. You have 5 minutes.
At the outset, I would like to extend my thanks and appreciation to the Special Rapporteur for preparing this first report before the Human Rights Council, which comes within the framework of implementation of the Special Rapporteur's mandate established in 1993 related to investigating the occupying powers violations of the principles and foundations of international humanitarian law on the territories of the State of Palestine occupied in 1967. We would like to express our support for the work of the Special Rapporteur within this mandate, while we condemn continuous attempts to target this mandate and those in charge of it. This does not come as a surprise, given that Israel refuses to cooperate with the Human Rights Council and its various mechanisms, including the mandate of the Special Rapporteur as well as the OHCHR. Mr. Vice President, the report under consideration regards the situation of prisoners and detainees and the arbitrary and deliberate mistreatment they are subjected to through illegal practices, using detention as a tool to prevent the Palestinian people from exercising the right to resist the occupation, using threats, blackmail, oppression, assaults, torture, and medical negligence, in addition to transferring detainees outside the occupied territories, including the use of administrative detention for repeated and long periods of time without any legal evidence. All these practices amount to flagrant violations of the Hague Convention, the Third and the Fourth Geneva Conventions, and the First Protocol, as well as violations of international customary humanitarian law. And all of these practices constitute complete elements of crimes against humanity and war crimes. Moreover, detention and arbitrary deprivation of liberty are a flagrant violation of the ICCPR, a violation of the Convention Against Torture, the CRC, Convention on the Right of the Child, which prohibits the deprivation of liberty for children. Mr. Vice President, since the occupation that began in 1967 until this day, more than 1 million Palestinians from the West Bank, including Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, have been arrested. There are still more than 5,000 Palestinians who are detained, including 1,000 administrative detainees, 32 women, and 160 children under the age of 18. As a result of torture and ill treatment, 237 martyrs have been martyred in the occupation prisons since 1967, including 75 as a result of the crime of medical negligence, the latest of which was the crime of martyrdom of Nasser Abu Hamid and Adnan Khadr. 24 of the current detainees suffer from cancer and tumors of various degrees, including the prisoner Walid Dakka, who has been detained for more than 37 years. There are also numerous examples of the way the occupation forces deal with activists and human rights defenders and arrest them, as the situation that happened with engineer Mohammed Al-Halabi, Director General of Roya World, who was arrested and subjected to the longest trial in history, and without presenting any charges or evidence, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In addition, they hold the bodies of martyrs, which amount to 373 in morgues and cemeteries of numbers. Mr. Vice President, the details contained in the report based on legal evidence require the United Nations, the various international organizations, and the high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions to work together in order to exert pressure on the occupying power so that it implements the recommendations contained in the report, especially the use of diplomatic, political, and economic measures as a tool of pressure, and not to provide any aid or assistance to the occupying power, and to prosecute the perpetrators of the crimes described in the present report under universal jurisdiction, as well as not contributing nor condoning the Israeli settler colonial apartheid and attempts to criminalize the Palestinian people who demand their collective right to existence and struggle in all forms and in accordance with the provisions of the law, so that they can put an end to the illegal occupation and exercise the inalienable right of our people to self-determination. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed, and I now give the floor to the Independent Commission for Human Rights of Palestine by video. Excuse, we have a small technical issue with the video, so we wait for a few seconds to resolve the issue before moving on. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, daily arbitrary detention is a key policy implemented by the Israeli occupying authorities against Palestinians. And deliberate medical negligence is one of the Israeli policies against Palestinian prisoners. In addition to the brutal conditions of detention that led 700 ill prisoners to suffer from diseases with different degrees of severity. Of these, 24 have cancer and tumors of various degrees. Walid Dakka, a 61 years old, has been detained since 1986, and he is in critical health condition. Dakka suffered from complications associated with partial resection of the right lung on 18 December 2022. He was diagnosed with a rare form of bone marrow cancer as an outcome of leukemia, which he had developed almost 10 years ago. Meanwhile, he was left without a serious medical attention. Currently accommodated in the Ramleh prison clinic, the Israeli occupying authorities and courts have rejected appeals for releasing him for further treatment. On May 2, 2023, political prisoner Khadr Adnan, 44 years, died in jail after he had been on hunger strike in protest against his arbitrary detention for 87 days in a row. Despite his critical state of health, the Israeli occupying authorities intentionally stalled response to Adnan's demands to release him and put an end to his arbitrary detention. ICHR hold the Israeli occupying authorities fully responsible for the life of the Palestinian prisoners, particularly Daca and the ill ones. We call the Human Rights Council to establish a special committee of inquiry into the Israeli violations and practices against ill Palestinian prisoners and the abuses they face, exert pressure on the occupying power to release them and save their lives, and allow the burial of hundreds of detained bodies.
Thank you. I now invite delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on her report. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We take note of the Special Rapporteur report and regret that she has not been allowed to visit the territory. We also reiterate that human rights in the opt should be properly addressed under item 4 or other item. We echo the recent statement by the Security Council and the High Commissioner, in particular on the importance of accountability. The EU is concerned about the high number of civilian casualties, including women and children. While recognizing Israel's right to protect itself, the EU recalls that the use of force must be proportionate and used as a last resort when it is strictly unavoidable to protect life. The EU reiterates its fundamental commitment to Israel's security, strongly condemns all forms of terrorism, as well as indiscriminate launching of rockets. The EU remains concerned about the extensive recourse by Israel to administrative detention without formal charges. It calls on Israel to respect the human rights of Palestinian minors faced with arrest and detention. The EU reiterates its opposition to Israel's settlement policy and activities. Settlements are illegal under international law. The EU calls on Israel to halt continued settlement expansion, regularization of illegal outposts, evictions, demolitions and forced transfers. The EU firmly condemns settler violence and calls for prevention and accountability. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the OIC.
Mr. Vice President, OIC Group thanks the SR for her report, reiterates its support for her mandate, and rejects attempts to silence her independent voice for exposing the grave violations of international human rights law by the Israeli apartheid regime. We are deeply concerned over denial of SR's access to the occupied Palestinian territory, as is the case also to all other special rapporteurs. We strongly condemn the occupation regime's attack on Jenin last week, resulting in loss of innocent lives. We share the SR's concerns that generations of Palestinians have endured widespread and systemic arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Since 1967, over 800,000 Palestinians, including children, have been detained. Currently, almost 5,000 Palestinians, including 155 children, are detained by Israel. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination that the occupying power targets appears as the ultimate so-called threat to be suppressed. The OIC endorses SR's observation that the Israeli occupation has been a tool of colonialism. The systematic use of arbitrary arrests, ill treatment, and torture are indeed foundational elements of apartheid and constitute blatant violation of UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law. We call upon the occupying power to immediately end its illegal occupation, release all Palestinian detainees, including Walid Daca, who was diagnosed with cancer, detained for more than 37 years, and release all withheld bodies of deceased Palestinians and guarantee dignified burials without any delay. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to take the floor on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur and thanks her presentation. For many years, we have maintained a firm position of solidarity with the Palestinian people and its just cause, and the condemnation of the massive, flagrant and systematic violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law committed by Israel. The group of friends expresses its grave concern at the continuing Israeli settlement and related activities, including the expansion of settlements, the expropriation of land, the demolition of houses, and the confiscation and destruction of property, which changed the physical character and demographic composition of the occupied territories and the occupied Syrian Golan. We also remain committed to strengthening our efforts, including active engagement in international initiatives aimed at ending the Israeli occupation, which constitutes an illegal colonial occupation and apartheid regime. The group of friends reaffirmed the unwavering support and solidarity with the Syrian Jews' demand and rights to restore the full sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan. We seize this opportunity to reaffirm our long-standing solidarity with the Palestinian people and reiterate our support for the realization of their legitimate national aspirations and inalienable rights, including self-determination and freedom in their independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman on behalf of Gulf Cooperation Council.
Mr. President, the GCC countries thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and condemn the reference to the practices and violations of the fundamental rights of the Palestinians and the widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty as one of the means of tightening the occupation's control over occupied territories and expanding its actions in violations of all international laws and resolutions. We condemn the means and pretexts pursued by the Israeli occupation to violate the rights of the Palestinian people and deprive them from their rights stipulated in international laws in the absence of international accountability for the occupation's ongoing aggression against the Palestinian people, the latest of which is on the city and camp of Jenin, which targeted civilians, children and women in civilian neighborhoods, which constitute a flagrant violation of international conventions and laws. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Palestinian people and their condemnation of the aspects of Israeli aggression against them and call on the international community to protect civilians and intervene quickly to stop the violations. The Israeli occupation's continued aggression and attacks against the Palestinian people impede the efforts of peace process to resolve the question of Palestine and achieve peace and stability in the Palestinian territories so that the Palestinian people can enjoy their legitimate right. Finally, we reaffirm our position on the centrality of the Palestinian question and our full support for the sovereignty of the Palestinian people over all Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the Arab Peace Initiative and resolutions of international legitimacy.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon on behalf of a group of Arab states.
Mr. Vice President, the Arab group thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and condemn the invasion of the Jenin refugee camp by the occupation forces, which led to the martyrdom of 12 Palestinians, the injury of more than 100, and the forcible displacement of 3,000, as well as the martyrdom of 4 Palestinians in the West Bank last Friday. We stress that such grave violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law aim to entrench colonialism and deprive the Palestinian people of their inalienable right to self-determination. We affirm our support for the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and the importance of adhering to the text of the resolution to investigate violations of principles and foundations of international law, international humanitarian law, and the Fourth Geneva Convention committed by the occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territories. We support the report on the occupying power's systematic policies of arbitrary detention, ill treatment, and torture as essential elements of the war crime committed against the Palestinian people and with the aim of eliminating the legitimate right to resist the Israeli colonizer. We reaffirm the report's reference that Israeli occupation is illegal, which would refute any attempt to justify its various violations, including the detention of any Palestinian. Therefore, the occupying power must immediately end its occupation of Palestinian territory and immediately release all Palestinian detainees, especially elderly, women, and the sick, including Walid Dakka, suffering from cancer, who has been detained for more than 37 years. The international community and international institutions should also call for the release of all the corpses of Palestinian martyrs. The international community should not contribute to the continuation of illegal occupation nor condone its crimes by activating the principle of universal jurisdiction to ensure accountability and impunity.
The war on behalf of a group of African states.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the African Group. Based on our common values that oppose colonialism, oppression, and apartheid, the African Group reaffirms its unwavering support for the historic struggle of the people of Palestine to realize their right to self-determination and establish their independent state based on the 4th of June 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Israeli military occupation of Arab territories lends itself to a situation of protracted conflict that has taken and continues to take a heavy toll on the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the people of the occupied Palestinian and Arab territories. The African Group reiterates the dire need to address all underlying root causes of the conflict and calls for an immediate end to the occupation, lifting the blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip, and seizing the detention and imprisonment of thousands of Palestinians and all other forms of collective punishment targeting the Palestinian people. The African Group rejects and condemns any racist decisions or laws taken by Israel against the Palestinian people, and we call on the international community to dismantle and ban the Israeli system of colonialism and apartheid. We oppose the Israeli settlement activities. Such acts lead to recurrent tensions, instability, and protraction of conflict. Mr. President, the African Group reiterates that the Human Rights Council has an ethical and legal obligation to act effectively to protect the Palestinian people and to bear its responsibility by taking urgent actions to address this situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. بداية يضم وفد بلادي صوته.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. At the outset, my country aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the groups that we belong to. In our national capacity, we condemn the occupation and continued dire conditions that further exacerbate the human rights situation in Palestinian territories that are occupied. The report highlights the arbitrary and systematic nature of illegal detention, including women and children, and the prohibitions for families to leave. And this is yet another abject manifestation of the impact of the occupations, the non-respect of international resolutions, and it is up to the Council to take action against the occupying power and put an end to the constant violations of human rights. The most recent one committed against civilians without any defense in the village of Geneva. This is state terrorism practiced against the Palestinian people. In light of this reality, we urge the Council to act and to implement effective mechanisms and measures, including independent investigations in the fight against these international crimes. And we invite the head of the ICJ to look into this situation. In conclusion, we state that this agenda item should remain on the agenda of the Council and should be a priority.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and deplore the continued refusal of the Israeli authorities to allow her access to the oPts. We strongly condemn the recent Israeli aggression on Jenin camp, the displacement of Palestinian families, and the killing of children. This is a new episode in a series of attacks, war crimes, and ongoing violations against the Palestinian people, in which thousands of innocent and unarmed civilians are killed in a flagrant violation of international law, relevant UN resolutions, and the Geneva Conventions. and this also threatens the chances to establish a Palestinian state having East Jerusalem as its capital. We call upon the international community to shoulder its legal and moral responsibilities in condemning Israeli aggressions and violations, and to work on ending the occupation and policies of collective punishment and siege on Gaza Strip, to stop arbitrary detention, administrative detention, torture, and ill treatment against Palestinian detainees and prisoners, and to reach them, especially children, and compensate the victims, and take all measures to protect the Palestinian people and hold the perpetrators of violations accountable. We stand by the Palestinian people until they recover all their legitimate rights, including their inalienable right to self-determination, establish their independent and fully sovereign state on the borders of June 1967. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
السيد الرئيس اطلع وفد بلادي
Mr. President, my delegation took note with great interest of the Special Rapporteur's report, which focused on the widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty in the oPts. We express our regrets vis-à-vis the escalating challenges faced by the Palestinian people as a result of the occupation, in the light of human rights violations, suppression of freedoms, and illegal practices, as well as the expansion of illegal settlement activities, demolition of houses, and attempts to change the status and religious identity of the city of Jerusalem. Those unilateral measures lead to repeated cycles of violence and tension, undermine chances for peace, and contribute to destabilizing security and stability in the region and the world. The illegal occupation of the Syrian Arab Golan and several areas in the Lebanese territory and the accompanying violations of the human rights of these people also continue. We take this opportunity to affirm that Egypt will spare no effort in supporting the rights of the Palestinian people until they achieve their legitimate demands, foremost amongst which is the establishment of their independent states on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, as well as seeking a last just and sustainable peace for a two-state solution, and to secure peace and stability for all the peoples of the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation shares the Special Rapporteur's concerns about the widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty in the occupied Palestinian territory. Based on the conclusions contained in the report, my delegation stresses the importance of putting an end to all illegal actions and practices in the Palestinian territory. This includes in East Jerusalem. Such actions and practices undermine the two-state solution and the prospects for peace. Particular reference here is made to the construction and expansion of settlements, the confiscation and demolition of Palestinian property, arbitrary detention, and forced displacement of the population. This is in addition to repeated aggressions by settlers following the recent dismantling of the Palestinian rural communities in the West Bank. Mr. Vice President, my delegation reiterates its full commitment to supporting the Palestinian people in realizing all their legitimate rights as guaranteed by international law. My delegation also reaffirms its firm position calling for the need to activate efforts aimed at achieving a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace based on the two-state solution and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and within the framework of diplomacy and peaceful dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Merci. Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. My delegation would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of her report. We urge strongly the Israeli authorities to cooperate with the mandate and ensure unimpeded access to occupied Palestinian territories. As you note in your report, the generalized and systematic practice of arbitrary arrests and detentions of Palestinians, especially children, may represent a crime against humanity. According to your analysis, these practices are a part of a system of control and surveillance related to the occupation, and it prevents Palestinians from exercising their fundamental freedoms and rights, including the right to self-determination. Israel must protect its civilian population. My delegation is alarmed by the disproportionate use of force by the Israeli army, just like what happened in Jenin last week. We urge Israel and the Palestinian Authority to respect fully international norms and standards in the area of international human rights law and IHL, including the protection and respect of the right to life. We urge both sides to return the bodies of their loved ones. We condemn the demolition of houses and forced displacement of Palestinians and legalization of colonies. We believe that the decision to build additional 5,000 houses further undermines the viability of a two-state solution and feeds into the cycle of violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation would like to align itself with the statements of the regional and political groups to which we belong. We welcome the general debate under this item. In this context, we have always affirmed our firm position vis-à-vis the Palestinian question and our full support to the Palestinian people to achieve all their legitimate and legal rights by extending their sovereignty over all their territories within the 1967 borders, as well as establishing their independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, we took note of the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian occupied territories, and we shared her concern about the systematic deprivation of liberty suffered by the Palestinian people as the result of illegal practices of deliberate and arbitrary detention by Israeli forces. In this context, we condemn in the strongest term the Israeli attacks on the city of Jenin and its camp, and we call upon the Israeli authorities to end military operations in the West Bank and stop the escalation. We reiterate our position rejecting the settlement policy, which violates the decisions of international legitimacy and make it difficult to achieve peace in the Middle East, which the Kingdom of Bahrain has always been keen to achieve, especially through the declaration of support for peace signed with Israel in 2020. In conclusion, we reiterate our full support to the Palestinian people. We call for intensifying efforts aimed at settling the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and revive the comprehensive peace process in accordance with the two-state solution, the principles of international law, and the Arab Peace Initiative.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Agenda Item 7 is a vital instrument that enables the international community to monitor and address human rights violations occurring in the occupied Palestinian territories. Until Israel ceases its unlawful occupation and answer to its crimes, the human rights situation in the occupied territories requires the Council's special and continuous attention. We therefore thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and express his deep concern over Palestinians' arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Israel's widespread and systematic detention of over 800,000 Palestinians, including children, without due process is alarming and violates international law. We are distraught that the criminalization and the incarceration of Palestinians ultimately target the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and undermine Palestinian existence. We stress the need to hold Israel accountable and urge for a moratorium on detaining minors, release all Palestinian detainees, and ensure dignified burials. Mr. Vice President, finally, Indonesia urges all states to support the consensual adoption of the OIC's draft resolution under Agenda Item 2 to ensure full and regular implementation of the mandate outlined in the HRC Resolution 31/36. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يرحب العراق
Thank you, Vice President. Iraq welcomes the presence of a Special Rapporteur, and we also appreciate her efforts and the presentation of her report, while we reiterate full support to her mandate. Mr. President, the arbitrary deprivation of liberty used by the occupying power against Palestinians that are detained in overcrowded prisons, they can't sleep, they do not have food, they do not receive medical support, they're tortured during prolonged periods of time, and this is indeed a crime against humanity, and also the systematic and wide-scale use of detention and arbitrary administrative detention without following obligatory and mandatory legal procedures. This is a foundation of the apartheid regime imposed on the Palestinian people. We condemn strongly the continuing crimes committed against vulnerable Palestinians, and most recently we've seen the aggression against the Jenin village that led to deaths and wounded. To all of this, we must add the forced displacement of population, destruction of houses and infrastructure. Iraq calls upon the international community to assume its ethical and legal responsibilities to put an end to the crimes committed by the occupying force against Palestinians and also the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. Iraq reiterates its constant support to the Palestinian people and their just cause. We need to see peace and put an end to the occupation and respect the inalienable right of Palestinian people to self-determination and the establishment of an independent state with capital in East Jerusalem.
Representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malaysia aligns itself with the statement of the OIC. The findings in the SR's report are appalling, but comes as no surprise. Evidently, impunity is still thriving at the expense of innocent Palestinians' human rights and fundamental freedoms. The situation in the oPt has only worsened over the years. Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in the first 5 months this year was more than double compared to the same period in 2022. Just last week, we witnessed the occupying powers' brutality in Jenin. The continued provocation, aggression, and incessant atrocities committed by the Israeli occupation powers are flagrant violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Malaysia strongly condemns these atrocities and urges Israel to immediately halt them, as well as the apartheid policies perpetrated against Palestinians. We condemn the disproportionate, illegal, and inhumane criminalization of Palestinians' fundamental freedoms. Malaysia echoes the call by the SR for Israel to cease unlawful and arbitrary detention of Palestinians. All detainees, especially children, must be released. We will support any follow-up action by the Human Rights Council in relation to the findings and recommendations by the SR to this end. Malaysia urges the international community to hold Israel accountable for its crimes against humanity and intensify efforts to free Palestinians from the protracted suffering and injustice caused by Israel's illegal occupation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Maldives welcomes the Special Rapporteur's report and strongly condemning the human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories as outlined in the report. We share concerns raised by the Special Rapporteur regarding the mistreatment of Palestinians involving both arbitrary and deliberate actions. This mistreatment extends beyond unlawful practices during detention, including different forms of confinement, such as physical, bureaucratic, and digital measures. The Maldives urges Israeli authorities to conduct unbiased and impartial investigation into incidents that cause harm or loss of life to Palestinians. Mr. Vice President, the government of Maldives strongly condemns the violent attacks carried out in the West Bank city of Jenin by Israeli forces. We express our heartfelt sympathies to the families affected and send sincere wishes for the swift recovery of those injured. We also remain deeply concerned by the disproportionate and excessive use of force on unarmed civilians, including women and children in the occupied Palestinian territories. The Maldives firmly believes that an internationally accepted two-state solution is the only viable solution to the question of Palestine. We call for the establishment of an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, where the people of both states live in peace, security, and harmony. The government and the people of Maldives stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their legitimate struggle for self-determination. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا للسيد نائب الرئيس والشكر موصول كذلك للمقررة الخاصة.
Mr. Vice President, we welcome the Special Rapporteur. The cause of prisoners in the Israeli occupation sheds light on one of the occupation's crimes against generations of the Palestinian people, which is enforced through racist legislation and criminal practices. The occupation also uses it to implement the legal settlement and annexation policies and to undermine the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination in a manner that reveals its real face as a colonial-based apartheid regime. The people of the occupied Syrian Golan, in turn, were targeted by this crime as part of the repressive policies that the Israeli occupation continues to implement against them. The occupation prisons are hotbeds of violations of all international standards and for brutal practices that don't spare children and women and even the bodies of martyrs. We also do not forget the suffocating siege of Gaza, which turned the Strip into an open collective prison. We call upon the Special Rapporteur to follow up on the case of Walid Daqa, a victim of international medical negligence, and we call for his immediate release to receive the necessary treatment. In conclusion, the prolongation of the cause of prisoners in the prisons of the Israeli occupation for years is one of the dangerous reflections of the silence by the international community on the crimes of the occupation that will not stop until its demise, and by ending its terrorist practices that threaten peace and security in the region with the sponsorship and encouragement of the US of A.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of.
Thank you, Vice President. The delegation of the Kingdom of Morocco stresses the importance of the seventh item on the agenda of this Council, the centrality of the Palestinian issue in the Kingdom's foreign policy, and its importance in the international agenda, given that there can be no peace in the Middle East without a just and final solution to this issue. The Kingdom of Morocco shares the international consensus that the solution to the Palestinian issue must be within the framework of the two-state solution, the State of Israel next to an independent Palestinian state on the June 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. In a related context, the Kingdom of Morocco reiterates its support and solidarity with the Palestinian people, especially at this critical and dangerous juncture in light of the recent and repeated Israeli attacks on Jenin and the deaths and destruction they have caused. We express condemnation and rejection of these attacks and call upon the international community and the great powers to intervene to stop this aggression against the Palestinian people and their territories. These attacks on the Palestinian territories do not contribute to creating an atmosphere conducive to dialogue and peace in the region. Even worse, this very dangerous situation threatens the remaining hopes for peace in the Middle East and would increase the scope of extremism and violence in the region, which requires urgent intervention by all in order to de-escalate in the region. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thanks her for submitting her report, which highlights the magnitude of the suffering, illegal and degrading practices and arbitrary and systematic deprivation of liberty that the Palestinians are subjected to in the occupied Palestinian territory, and which the occupying power has been using for decades as a main tool to impose their hegemony and oppressive and racist policies on the Palestinian people to deprive them from their inalienable rights, including the right to self-determination. In this regard, Tunisia strongly condemns the continuation of these practices, particularly most recently in Jenin, and reiterates its solidarity with the Palestinian people and its right to self-determination and to recover its legitimate rights and the rights of the Palestinian state to exercise sovereignty over its entire territories since 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the resolutions of international legitimacy and the Arab Peace Initiative. Tunisia renews its call to the international community and to this Council to shoulder its legal and moral responsibilities to activate the tools of accountability with regard to the violations committed against the Palestinian people and to compel the occupying power to fully adhere to the relevant UN resolutions. In conclusion, we call on the Office of the High Commissioner to continue its efforts to update the database on the activities of companies and business entities in the settlements within the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. South Africa aligns itself with a statement delivered on behalf of the African Group. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the UDHR. Yet for Palestinians, there is no cause to celebrate, as they continue to be denied their equal and inalienable right enshrined in the UDHR. This injustice is etched on the pages of the Special Rapporteur's report. Indeed, it demonstrates the extent and manner in which the arbitrary deprivation of liberty is used to perpetuate what the Special Rapporteur terms Israel's colonial settler apartheid. This includes the abuses perpetrated against Palestinians in Israel custody, including the deliberate and systematic denial of equal health care as exemplified by the tragic case of Mr. Walid Daka, which the Council special procedures are pursuing. This arbitrary deprivation of liberty is yet another manifestation of Israel's illegal occupation. Accordingly, South Africa urges the international community to put an end to the occupation once and for all, and to hold Israel accountable for criminalizing the actions of Palestinians. Given our shameful past, South Africa stands with the Palestinians, as we know they are suffering all too well. Our solidarity with Palestinian people is captured by former President Mandela, who stated, "We, South Africans, cannot consider ourselves free until Palestinians are free." I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
President, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is not sustainable and continues to be destabilizing. 2022 has already been the most violent year in decades. In 2023, up to now, more than 190 Palestinians lost their lives in the occupation-related violence by Israeli forces in the occupied Palestinian territory. The recent escalation of the incitement, settler violence and provocative actions targeting Palestinians and the historical status quo of the Haram al-Sharif increases our concerns. Yet again, we recently witnessed a human tragedy in Geneva. Israeli forces carried out an extensive operation that killed 12 and injured more than 140 Palestinians. Thousands of Palestinians had to leave their homes. Such actions do not serve any purpose other than poisoning the atmosphere in the region. We find unacceptable that the Israeli government's approval of the construction of approximately 5,700 new residential units in the occupied West Bank. Illegal settlements have exceeded 13,000 units since the beginning of this year. These actions curtail fundamental rights and freedoms of people of Palestine and are in complete contradiction with international law, in particular with the relevant UN resolutions. Turkey is of the view that a lasting peace can be ensured only through a just and viable peace with Palestine. Turkey supports efforts to ensure that a sovereign and contiguous state of Palestine, based on the pre-1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital, takes place in the international community as a sovereign and equal member on the basis of the established parameters of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
We align with the OIC statement and thank the SR for our first report to the Council. We reiterate our support for the mandate. We strongly condemn the recent attack on Jenin by the Israeli occupation forces, which is the worst violence in the West Bank over the decades. The current report presents a comprehensive overview regarding the use of arbitrary deprivation of liberty as a key instrument of Israel's domination and oppression in the occupied Palestinian territory. Such oppressive tools are manifestations of impunity as well as structural and systemic human rights violations, constituting dehumanization of Palestinian people and crimes against humanity. The SR has rightly observed that Israel continues to derogate from its international obligations, including ensuring access to a fair trial and prohibition against torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. We share concerns over the likelihood of these offenses being cumulatively committed as part of apartheid policy of de-Palestinization of the occupied territory. We echo the recommendations for the release of all Palestinian detainees, especially children, and abolishing the unlawful occupation as the arbitrary deprivation is an instrument to prolong this occupation. We call on this Council to uphold its responsibility towards the Palestinian people and urge Israel to immediately end its occupation and comply with its obligations under international human rights law. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela by video statement.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We thank the rapporteur for the presentation report. We share the concerns related to deliberate ill treatment that are committed by the occupying power against Palestinians through illegal practices of detention and continued use of prisons with confinement techniques that are widespread. We condemn the case of political prisoner Walid Daka and urge his immediate release. The policies of domination, racial oppression of Israel has as their objectives the subjugation and preservation of colonial apartheid over Palestinian people, including through the arbitrary deprivation of liberty, arbitrary detentions, torture, inhuman treatment, degrading treatment, and collective punishment. It is clear that the prolonged occupation of territory in Palestine and Syrian Golan has a negative impact on living conditions. The occupation by Israel has been a tool of colonial conquest through the building of settlements and the intensification of methods of confinement against all Palestinian people. We condemn the recent attacks against refugee camps in Jenin, a crime committed by Israeli armed forces. Reiterate our full support to the inalienable right of Palestinian people to self-determination and to build a free, sovereign, independent state with borders before 1967 and East Jerusalem as the capital.
Distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation is deeply concerned at the intensification of hostilities in the oPt, including the recent armed incursion into the Jenin refugee camp, which resulted in serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, much of it borne by completely innocent civilians. Despite this Council's adoption of resolution after resolution on the worsening human rights situation in the occupied territories, our collective appeals for restraint have been largely ignored by an increasingly belligerent occupying power. Inaction by the international community has simply emboldened the occupying power to further tighten its military and economic stranglehold on the already much abused Palestinian people. The blockade of Gaza, the expansion of illegal settlements, the creeping annexation of Palestinian territory is simply generating more frustration, despair, and anger. The situation is dire and destined to deteriorate even further, with potential consequences which surely serve no one's best interests. The international community cannot continue to remain disengaged from this ever-worsening injustice. The people of Palestine deserve far greater attention and support from this Council and from international Geneva more broadly. Zimbabwe reaffirms its support for a two-state solution that will allow for peaceful coexistence between Israel and an independent Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, sir.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Namibia thanks the Special Rapporteur for her timely report, which brings to the attention of the Human Rights Council the concerns related to the widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. Vice President, as the Special Rapporteur correctly points out, Israelis' practices of deprivation of liberty should not be viewed in isolation, as they are part of the Israeli system of oppression, domination, and its apartheid machinery aimed at frustrating the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people and prolonging its illegal occupation. We in Namibia had a similar experience before the dawn of independence, where the then apartheid regime, amongst others, arbitrarily detained any person who dared to advocate for the right of self-determination and independence of the Namibian people. Namibia therefore calls on the occupying power, Israel, to cease with its practice of arbitrary detentions in the occupied Palestinian territory. We echo calls for the immediate release of Palestinian political prisoners, including Mr. Walid Daka, whose medical condition continues to worsen due to deliberate medical neglect by Israel. Finally, we urge all states to contribute towards the advisory proceeding before the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory by submitting their written submissions within the said deadline of 25th July 2023. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
Mr. President, we would like to align ourselves with the statements of the groups to which we belong. We commend the position of the Special Rapporteur, which considered that the occupation cannot be reformed and calls for ending the occupation, which is the cause of all sufferings in the Arab-occupied lands, including Palestine. In this context, we support her report and her call for the international community to many things, namely to sanction the occupying power by all legal, diplomatic and economic means according to the law without discrimination, and to end the policy of double standards. We reiterate our firm position and we condemn all the crimes perpetrated in the camp of Jenin, which is a perpetration of the practices of the occupying power. We concur with the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur. We salute her courage, her stance calling for justice and truth. We reiterate our support to all the rights of the Palestinian people to recognize their independent sovereign state along the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, so that the Palestinian people can recover all their rights according to international resolutions, Arab Peace Initiative, and we call for Israel's withdrawal from all Arab-occupied lands, including Syrian Golan and Lebanese territories. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. Vice President, China attaches great importance to the report of the Special Rapporteur and her concern about the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. The issue of Palestine is a long-standing one. The prolonged occupation and frequent turbulence have gravely hampered the economic and social development of Palestine and the human rights of its people. Recently, tensions have been on the rise in the oPt. Once again, China urges the cessation of all settlement activities, of unilateral change of the status quo, and of unilateral actions that may aggravate tensions in the oPt. The international community should increase its development and humanitarian assistance to Palestine, support efforts to safeguard the human rights of the Palestinian people, and make practical efforts for the early resumption of peace talks between Palestine and Israel on the basis of the two-state solution. China has always firmly supported the just cause of the Palestinian people to restore their legitimate national rights and supported the Middle East peace process. China will continue to make unremitting efforts to promote an early, comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the issue of Palestine. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. First, my country associates itself with the statements by the groups to which it belongs, and we thank the Special Rapporteur for its report, and we strongly condemn the last assault of the Israeli authorities in Jenin, which led to 12 deaths and hundreds injured and dozens of families being outside of their homes. These violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law despoils the Palestinian people from its full right of self-determination. Mr. Vice President, we fully support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and the importance of full commitment to investigations into the abuses of the occupying power in the oPt, which consists a violation of the principles and norms of international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Convention and international law. And we stress what occurred in the body of the report as to the various aspects of illegitimate actions of the Israeli authorities in Palestine. And it is of great importance for the international community to understand that the illegitimacy of Israeli occupation cannot be legitimized and cannot be humanized by just barely trying to resolve some of its aspects. And by virtue of the UN Charter and international law, the international community must not participate and must not condone the actions of the occupier and must hold accountable the perpetrators of crimes and violations against the Palestinian people and bring them to justice. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Chile would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his report, or her report. We would like to deal with some issues of particular concern. According to the report, approximately 7,000 Palestinians, hundreds of children among them, have been arrested in 2022. Over the last 20 years, Israeli authorities have arrested between 500 and 700 children every year. People have been tortured and were abused and given and subjected to degrading and inhuman treatment. According to, we find very vague motives for these actions. The population is simply peacefully protesting the occupation. Another worrisome point is the fact that the Palestinian people are subjected to arbitrary detention because Israeli officials on the West Bank so declare. Chile, sir, has always stated that the Israeli colonies in occupied Palestinian territory are illegal. We condemn the occupation of these territories. Chile also endorses the recommendations in the report and calls on Israel to stop administrative detention of children as recommended recently during the most recent UPR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. My delegation agrees with the statements made by the groups to which it belongs and thanks the Council for holding this interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian occupied territory. Senegal is concerned at the occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, which have led to violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms for people in the Palestinian territories. My country encourages Israel to further cooperate with the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights to ensure better management of human rights issues. Moreover, my delegation repeats its support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to have its own independent state on the basis of the frontiers of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, in keeping with UN resolutions and international law. It calls finally on the international community to always prioritize a two-state solution and to relaunch the peace process in order to achieve a definitive end to this conflict. Thank you.
السيد الرئيس يؤيد وفد بلادي ما جاء في بيانات المجموعة الإقليمية.
Thank you, sir. My delegation endorses the statements made by the groups to which it belongs and the statement by the independent group on the situation of occupied Palestinian territories. The human rights violations of Israel must stop. Violations that lead to murder, expansion of colonies and settlements, forced displacement, collective punishment, the imposition of restrictions, abuse of force, and racial discrimination. These are all factors which show how important this agenda item is, and the Council must pay particular attention to this issue and condemn these repeated aggressions and violations which run counter to international human rights, international law, and take all necessary steps to make Israel as the occupying power to put an end to these violations and allow a decent life for the Palestinian people and allow it to establish an independent state with its capital as East Jerusalem with the frontiers of 1967. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritania.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation supports the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and wishes to thank her for her report. My country condemns the recent events in Jenin and its refugee camp when the occupation forces raided the Jenin refugee camp, resulting in the fall of 12 martyrs, the injury of more than 100 people, and the forced eviction of 3,000 people from their homes, and the further attacks on the West Bank last Friday are condemnable, and we affirm that such grave violations constitute an infringement on the international humanitarian law and the international human rights law, and as such must be addressed by the international community and must receive serious attention and follow-up from this Council. My delegation stresses the centrality of Item 7 on the Council's agenda in our efforts to stand against the daily and systematic violations of human rights as committed by the occupying power against the defenseless Palestinian people. Indeed, any attempt to curtail Item 7 will contribute directly to increasing those violations, perpetuating impunity and undermining the very status of this Council as an international law mechanism for protecting and promoting human rights globally. In conclusion, my delegation calls on the international community to pressure Israel to get it to respect international law in the occupied Palestinian territory and to activate the principle of universal jurisdiction to ensure accountability, reduce impunity, and stop all violations and abuses against the steadfast Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
السيد نائب الرئيس يبقى استمرار الاحتلال الممنهج على الشعب الفلسطيني.
Thank you. The agenda item 7 deserves its place and is indispensable in order to reveal the violations committed and protect the Palestinian people against these violations, which have been targeting both collectively and individually the Palestinian people. The activities in Jenin have been intolerable. Violence is increasing in its scope, and measures by Israel are illegal. These impede a two-state solution and impede a just solution. We condemn all these unilateral activities, such as incursions into Palestinian cities, ongoing settlements, confiscation of lands, and other flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the Resolution 2332 of the Security Council, the protection of the international community and our Council must pressure Israel as the occupying power, which is responsible for the violations, to put an end to these violations. And in conclusion, we, with our partners, are working to ensure a just and stable peace, which is a necessity in both the region and internationally.
رئيس وفد السودان ينضم لبيانات المجموعات العربية والإفريقية ودول منظمة التعاون الإسلامي. نشكر السيدة المقررة الخاصة على
we support the statement made on behalf of the African Arab groups and other groups. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his report and comments, and we repeat our support for his mandate and the maintenance on the agenda of this item. We reaffirm our ongoing position of supporting the Palestinian people and its right to have an independent state, and we support the efforts calling for a definitive settlement to this crisis, which has persisted for too long. And in this connection, we need to put an end to the cycle of violence, and we call on the occupying power to respect its commitments and obligations under international law and international resolutions. We call on the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the Speaker corrects himself, to counter human rights violations, including those with respect to prisoners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for presentation of the report, and we welcome the conclusions and recommendations contained in the report. We take a positive view that the systemic and very serious violations of the rights of Palestinian people are being condemned in occupied territories. It's alarming that in 2022 there were hundreds of children that were detained without any judgments. the generalized and systematic use of arbitrary detentions, the lack of due process, ill treatment, and torture that take place in occupied Palestinian territories do represent serious violations of human rights qualified as international crimes that can be prosecuted under international law and crimes against humanity. Madam Vice President, we would like to express our solidarity with the historic cause of the Palestinian people, and we're in favor of a lasting solution of the situations. The international community should continue its efforts to change the situation until the time when Palestine is recognized as a full-fledged member of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Brazil thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We share the concern expressed in the report about the practices described of widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty in the oPts, which may amount to international crimes. We also call the Israeli government to cooperate with the work of the Special Rapporteur. Brazil condemns all violence against civilians, including acts of terrorism. At the same time, we note an aggravating trend in the situation of human rights in the oPts, exacerbated by settler violence and escalating military actions, affecting many Palestinians, including Brazilian nationals. The continued occupation of the oPts, unlawful under international law, and the expansion of settlements not only undermines the prospects for peace, but also restricts several human rights of the Palestinian people, including civil, political, economic, and social rights. The Brazilian government reaffirms its staunch commitment to the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, with a mutually agreed and internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation associates itself with the statements of the groups to which it belongs and welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur and supports its contents when it comes to the illegitimacy of Israeli occupation and the call for the immediate end of this occupation and the release of all Palestinian detainees, particularly those vulnerable among them. Algeria condemns the raiding by the Israeli authorities to the Jenin refugee camp. Such practices, among others, constitute a racist repression, an institutional one against Palestinian people. Algeria condemns the blockade on the Gaza Strip and calls for its end. Mr. Vice President, similar grave violations to international humanitarian law and international human rights law have the following aim: to entrench occupation and to deprive the Palestinian people of their inalienable right to self-determination. This is why we call on the international community to shoulder its legal responsibilities and to implement the tools of accountability in order to ensure that impunity will not be tolerated anymore and to ensure that the Palestinian people will get to practice its right to instate its own independent state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Mr. President, Lebanon welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thanks her for her report, which we followed with great concern and interest, and which highlights the policies by the occupying power based on arbitrary arrest, mass incarceration, and collective punishment. It aims at furthering the occupation and subjugating the Palestinian people and depriving it of its right, namely the right to self-determination. We are particularly upheld by paragraph 96 of the report, where the Special Rapporteur concludes that, I quote, mass incarceration reinforces the power imbalance between Palestinian and Israeli institutions and facilitates the settler colonial encroachment by shifting from the security of the occupying state to the security of the occupation itself. End of quote. Mr. President, in absence of any practical measures, law will remain on paper and as a proof. And since 1967, more than 800,000 Palestinians have been arrested and detained, including children, by the occupation forces without any evidence or arrest warrants. Finally, we should not forget the case of political detainee Walid Ad-Daka, who has completed his sentence but is still imprisoned despite his deteriorating health condition, and we join our voice in calling for his immediate release. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam.
Mr. Vice President, Brunei Darussalam aligns itself with the statement delivered by Pakistan on behalf of the OIC, and we welcome the report by the Special Rapporteur as well as the report presented earlier this session by the COI, and would like to thank them both for their comprehensive presentations. However, we note with regret the continued challenges faced by the Special Rapporteur, among others due to the occupying power, and urge them to engage constructively with these bodies. For many years, Palestinians continue to face severe injustice and inhuman repression by the occupying power. We reiterate our strong condemnation over such practices, as well as the repeated and continued violations of the human rights and dignity of Palestinians and the excessive use of force against them. We condemn the recent attacks by the occupying power on the Geneva refugee camp, which worsens an already unacceptable humanitarian situation and only adds to the longer sufferings in modern history, further obstructing the achievement of a comprehensive and lasting peace. We must exert all efforts to ensure that the Palestinian cause remains at the forefront of the international agenda, and including and especially if we wish to see that they are not left behind in the successful achievement of the SDGs. Brunei joins the international community in calling on the occupying power to cease attacks against civilians. The occupation and annexation by the occupying power, including the actions undertaken by them, and the widespread and systemic arbitrary deprivation of liberty highlighted by the report, violate international law and cannot remain unaddressed. We firmly believe that the path to long-lasting peace can only be achieved through the two-state solution with an independent state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem at its capital. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of the report that contains clear conclusions and recommendations. We express our deep concern in connection with illegal detentions and confinement inflicted on Palestinian people. We condemn these practices and systematic violations of human rights of Palestinians that continue not to be able to use their land. They're being evicted from their homes, and they're illegally occupied under international law. And now more than 800,000 Palestinians have been detained since 1960. The Palestinians are found guilty without any proof, without due process, and they're held in detention without any charges. Palestinians are in a permanent state of vulnerability. The Council should pay attention to the misuse of surveillance technologies, the use of social media, and discrimination and violation of fundamental rights of Palestinians. It is a grave concern that digital surveillance is used to facilitate practices of colonization by the occupying power. Today, we're having discussions on the use of technology and human rights. The international community cannot remain silent in the situation of Palestinian people. We like to express our solidarity with Palestinian people, and we support a broad, just, and lasting solution to the conflict through dialogue and the consolidation of a free, sovereign, and independent Palestinian state. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for her update. This recent Israeli operation in Jenin forms part of a worrying trend of large-scale incursions, frequently involving live fire and resulting in civilian casualties. We urge immediate de-escalation and protection of civilians, including ensuring humanitarian access. We condemn all attacks on civilians, including last week's car ramming attack in Tel Aviv. We also condemn the extreme settler violence witnessed in the West Bank villages of Termasaya and Urif, and the killing of 4 Israeli civilians in Eli. We have noted with considerable concern that the stated objective of certain recent raids by Israeli forces has been the demolition of the family home of a person accused of a terrorist attack. We call on Israel to abide by its obligations under the 4th Geneva Convention. It is imperative that actions by all parties are in line with international law and contribute to breaking the cycle of violence. In particular, we recall Israel's responsibility as the occupying power to protect all civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. All incidents of violence must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible held accountable. We call on Israel to end the practice of administrative detention of Palestinians, including children, and immediately and unconditionally release those who are detained. Special Rapporteur, how can the international community ensure humanitarian access in the occupied Palestinian territory in the context of escalating violence? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
سيد نائب الرئيس طلعت بعثة بلادي بكل اهتمام على تقرير المقرر.
Thank you, Vice President. We took note of the contents of the report on the situation of human rights in occupied Palestinian territories since 1960. My country denounces and condemns the escalation of violence by Israel, especially the most recent attack against Jenin that destroyed the lives of numerous persons, leading to many wounded as well. We express our sincere condolences to the families of victims. The delegation of my country reiterates our appeal to the international community to put an end to these atrocious acts and ensure the protection of civilians. Mr. Vice President, we reaffirm the importance of the Palestinian cause. It is a priority for my country. My country has always provided assistance to the Palestinian people with a view of ensuring that they restore their rights and also are in a position to create an independent state within the 1967 border in line with international initiatives and the Arab Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Sri Lanka thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We are deeply concerned about the worsening humanitarian situation, including civilian casualties, settler violence, and indiscriminate attacks against civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Continued settlement building, demolitions, and evictions erode trust and fuel tensions. The cycle of violence must stop, and all parties should refrain from unilateral actions that further undermine prospects for a peaceful settlement to the protracted conflict. Sri Lanka reiterates its unwavering support for the legitimate and inalienable right of the people of Palestine to statehood and to the natural resources in their territory. Any form of annexation would constitute a violation of the international law and jeopardize peace and security in the Middle East region. While recognizing the legitimate and sensitive security concerns of both the Palestinian and the Israeli people, Sri Lanka observes that indiscriminate actions and disproportionate reactions against unarmed civilians will only worsen the prospect for lasting peace. We continue to believe that a negotiated two-state solution based on the 1967 borders is the path for lasting peace, ensuring the rights and safety of both Palestinians and Israelis. We urge the parties to the conflict to resume direct negotiations in good faith and demonstrate political commitment in furtherance of the goal of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the League of Arab States.
Yeah, تفضل. Mr. Vice President, in light of the daily and ongoing violations committed by the occupying power, the League of Arab States underscores the necessity of keeping item 7, which discusses the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, as a standing item on the Council's agenda. The League of Arab States stresses the importance of supporting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, and the importance of enabling her to discharge her mandate to full completion and without interference. It is the moral duty of the Human Rights Council to condemn all systematic and wide-ranging policies and crimes conducted by the occupying power against the Palestinian people. The occupying power's violations have continually gone too far, taking the form of land confiscation, demolition of homes and property, looting of wealth and natural resources, closure of roads and Palestinian zones, and the blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip for over 15 years now. This is in addition to the systematic forced displacement of the Palestinian people from their villages and communities with the aim of perpetuating the policy of annexation and replacement colonial expansionism, also known as settler colonialism, which is considered among the most egregious violations to the Geneva Conventions, to international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We demand that the Human Rights Council take immediate action to ensure international protection for the Palestinian people and to realize their legitimate inalienable rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. Vice President, the Islamic Republic of Iran associates itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the OIC and the GOA. Mr. Vice President, almost 5,000 Palestinians are currently detained in Israeli prisons, 1/5 of them without charge or trial. Per year, 500 to 700 children are subjected to the Israeli detention, and the number of deaths caused by their relentless detention policies and practices are shocking. The latter is exemplified by the death of Qadir Adnan on 2 May 2023 due to the hunger strike. These statistics are only a tip of the iceberg of the largest open-air prison in the world, in which the occupying power has colonized and captivated the Palestinian people through the physical, bureaucratic, and digital collective confinement for more than 7 decades. The widespread and systematic arbitrary deprivation of liberty, mass arbitrary detention, as well as denial of the right of prisoners to a fair trial, torture and ill treatment are the quotidian realities of the Palestinian life. We support strongly the mandate of Madam Special Rapporteur and echo her voice on the situation of carceral continuum in Palestinian territories, which clearly testifies the commission of war crimes and crime against humanity by an apartheid regime. The UN system, including the HRC and its related mechanisms, must take all necessary measures in order to put an end to this long-standing and shameful impunity and make the occupying power accountable for all its systemic and systematic human rights and humanitarian law violations in the oPt. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. First of all, I should like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her substantive report on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. We are concerned by the information submitted on the practice of systematic arbitrary arrests in the occupied territories. We cannot fail to be concerned at the further worsening of the situation in this area, as well as the remaining tensions and outbreaks of violence. We, for our part, continue to call for relaunching direct Palestinian-Israel negotiations to which there's no alternative. We would stress that a full and just settlement to the conflict is achievable only on generally recognized international bases with a two-state solution. Only really a true renewed peace process can facilitate mutual trust, lessen tensions and radicalization, and improve the situation as regards human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Madam Special Rapporteur, France expressed its deepest concern at the worsening tension in the occupied Palestinian territories. France condemns settler violence against Palestinian civilians and their properties. This violence is unacceptable and must stop. The perpetrators must be held accountable before the competent judicial authorities. France expressed its concern with the very heavy human toll of the recent military operations in Geneva. Israel's security imperatives cannot absolve it from complying with its international obligations under international humanitarian law, including the imperative to ensure the protection of civilians in the occupied territories and the use proportionate force. France condemns in the strongest terms the recent terrorist attacks which claimed the lives of Israeli civilians. In this context of extreme tension, it is imperative to refrain from any provocation and any unilateral measure likely to fuel the spiral of violence. France is very concerned by the acceleration of the building of settlements which are illegal under international law and which we condemn. France calls on the Israeli government to reverse its recent decision to approve the construction of more than 5,000 new housing units in several West Bank settlements. France would like to recall that only a two-state solution with Jerusalem as the capital of both states allows for a just and lasting peace. France stands ready to contribute together with Spartan to credible political process leading to lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on the list. We will now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. And first I give the floor to the representative of Medical Aid for Palestinians.
Medical Aid for Palestinians welcomes the Special Rapporteur's latest report on the deprivation of liberty in the occupied Palestinian territory. In Gaza, 16 years of arbitrary closure entraps more than 2 million Palestinians, routinely denying health workers access to training and professional development, and patients access to essential health services. This confinement is arbitrarily tightened at will. During its military offensive in May, Israel intensified movement restrictions, preventing 432 patients and their companions from exiting Gaza to receive treatment in hospitals elsewhere. In the West Bank, the consolidation of illegal Israeli settlements is facilitated by a physical infrastructure of restricted roads, checkpoints, military bases, and closed military areas. As was seen in Israel's attack on Geneva earlier this month, the closure of entire urban areas in the West Bank during military assaults has become a routine practice, denying access for healthcare workers to injured people, and often exacerbating the loss of life. What the Special Rapporteur describes as the occupation's carceral regime of physical and bureaucratic confinement has therefore fragmented Palestinian society, stymied the development of its healthcare system, and directly undermined Palestinians' rights to health and dignity in ways that cannot be addressed by humanitarian and aid responses alone. We therefore ask the Special Rapporteur, what immediate and practical steps should third states take to move beyond mere sticking plasters and to address the physical and bureaucratic confinement of Palestinians that are at the root cause of humanitarian needs? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor for a joint statement by the World Jewish Congress.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored to make this statement on behalf of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, the European Union of Jewish Students, and the World Jewish Congress. Our three organizations believe that true progress towards a just and lasting resolution between Israelis and Palestinians can only be achieved through meaningful and respectful dialogue, based on a fair and evidence-based assessment of the realities on the ground. Regrettably, the current mandate of the Special Rapporteur does exactly the opposite. Firstly, the mandate, due to its fundamental flaws, fails to provide an unbiased and objective assessment of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The consistent focus on criticizing Israel, while turning a blind eye to the actions and responsibilities of the Palestinian leadership, undermines its credibility, leading to a lack of nuance and a failure to acknowledge the challenges faced by both parties. Secondly, the role of the Special Rapporteur should be to promote human rights and impartially investigate alleged violations. However, the frequent use of inflammatory language and one-sided narratives perpetuates a biased and divisive approach, contributes to the polarization and further entrenchment of opposing views, and hinders any progress towards a peaceful resolution. Mr. President, this is the only HRC mandate that has not undergone the review, rationalization, improvement process envisioned by the institutional building package, and remains in violation of its own rules for 15 years. If this Council is seriously interested in promoting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, we call upon it to look at its own mechanisms first and start challenging its ingrained biases, which have tarnished the work and reputation of this Council for far too long. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Badil, Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My name is Sana Daqqa. I'm the wife of a Palestinian prisoner, Walid Daqqa, and I'm here today to draw your attention to the critical health situation of Walid. Walid is a 62-year-old Palestinian who completed his full 37-year sentence in 2023 on the 24th of March. Walid is facing the threat of death by virtue of a number of diagnoses, including one from the prison clinic in Israel. And although he holds an Israeli passport, the Palestinian authorities are still depriving him from the freedom to leave the premises in order to receive treatment. More than 700 Palestinian prisoners face medical negligence, 23 of whom suffer from fatal cancerous tumors. The apartheid policies of Israel target all of the Palestinian people through repressive policies. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her report that calls on the international community to hold Israel to account due to its policy of systematic detention. Walid, myself, and our daughter Milad call upon all of you to act immediately to put pressure on Israel in order to get the release of Walid and the 23 prisoners who are suffering from cancer and all other detainees. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Coordinating Board of Jewish Organizations.
Vice President, we have seen a lot of bias directed at Israel at the UN over the years, but the Special Rapporteur's current report reaches a shameful low point by seeking to justify a so-called right to resist. The report states that it's not condoning crimes committed by the Palestinians, but the rapporteur knows well that, according to the Palestinians themselves, their resistance activities as they describe them are often centered around violent attacks against Israeli civilians, including women and children, which have killed and injured thousands. This key context of the vital need for strong and appropriate Israeli counterterrorism measures is, unsurprisingly, missing from the rapporteur's report. Member states must speak out against this moral outrage and start to contemplate what is becoming of the UN, which has now become a place where anti-Semitism is ignored and, indeed, where the standard definition of anti-Semitism is under attack. In fact, by this rapporteur, and terrorism can be explained away as long as the victims are Israelis. Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Al-Haq, Law in the Service of Man.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you to Special Rapporteur for her report. Palestinian civil society organizations, including human rights organizations, have been the subject of campaigns and attacks to silence them and cripple their work by Israeli occupying authorities. Since 1967, hundreds of organizations have been smeared and have had their offices raided and shut down, and many of them have been outlawed under different pretexts, including the link to so-called terrorist organizations. The campaign is an extension to what Zionist militias has started in 1948 to violently suppress and erase Palestinian people as a nation and deny them their right to self-determination and replace them with another group for whom a state was established exclusively. Anyone who opposes the Israeli settler colonial project and who works to materialize the right of the Palestinian people's right to return to self-determination is seen by Israel as a threat to its settler colonial ambition in Palestine and is as such targeted. This does not include only Palestinian organizations, but extends to international organizations and bodies and mandates such as UN Commissions of Inquiry, Special Rapporteurs, and Special Rapporteurs. Practices and policies against Palestinian organizations and human rights defenders may amount to the crime against humanity of persecution and apartheid, prosecutable under the Rome Statute of the ICC. Mr. Vice President, crimes perpetrated.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Your time is up. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Palestinian Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights welcomes the recent publication of the update to the UN database by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The update represents an important step forward despite its long overdue release. According to the report, 15 businesses may have ceased or are no longer involved in conducting reportable activity during the reporting period, which demonstrates the significant impact the database can have in encouraging and promoting compliance with international law. Nevertheless, we are concerned that the Office of the High Commissioner has not identified new businesses that began during the reporting period to conduct reportable activity. Human Rights Council Resolution 31/36 clearly provides that the database should be updated annually, thereby requiring regular reporting as well as the addition and removal of businesses. The UN database is a crucial tool for the promotion and protection of the human rights of the Palestinian people, as it sends the message that no businesses should be benefiting from the violations of their rights. Considering the alarming settlement expansion and settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territory, PCHR calls on the Office of the High Commissioner to implement its mandate vis-à-vis the UN database in an adequate and consistent way. PCHR also calls on member states to increase their support for international accountability tools and mechanisms such as the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, which are both currently examining Israel's actions in the oPt. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Jerusalem Institute of Justice.
Mr. President, the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, "The Human Rights Council disproportionate focus on Israel undermines its credibility and distracts from its mission of promoting universal human rights." Under Agenda Item 7, this Council has adopted more condemnatory resolutions, organized special sessions, and appointed rapporteurs to investigate Israel than any other country in the world. Item 7 refers to the occupied Palestinian territories, but the Council neglects to address the responsibility of Palestinian leaders in this matter. This Council overlooks the fact that the Palestinian Authority allocates a substantial portion of its annual budget to compensating terrorists. Similarly, it deliberately turns a blind eye to Hamas' exploitation of children in hostilities, contributing to a dangerous cycle of indoctrination, hatred, and incitement of violence within the Palestinian society. Instead, Agenda Item 7 only serves as another platform to delegitimize the State of Israel. We do not need to look far back in human history to see the devastating effects of systematic demonization of a nation. Yet, almost 80 years after the Holocaust, Israel still bears the burden of being unfairly demonized through its own dedicated agenda item. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice calls upon this Council to eliminate the discriminatory Agenda Item 7 and actually work for the protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling.
Mr. President, as of January 2023, over 373 Palestinian bodies who were killed by Israeli occupying forces have been detained, among them 12 children and 11 prisoners. These detained bodies are being held in refrigerated containers or in designated areas called number cemeteries, where Israeli authorities label each grave with a number without names. Access to Palestinians to these number cemeteries is strictly prohibited. As a form of collective punishment against Palestinians, the practice of withholding bodies by the Israeli occupying forces is not only about physical custody, but also about denying families essential information regarding the circumstances of how their loved ones were killed, effectively depriving their families of that closure. Denying access to withheld bodies prevents their families from performing traditional burial rituals per their cultural and religious beliefs, as they are unable to properly mourn their beloved ones. A Palestinian mother whose son's body is being withheld by IOF after being killed by them said to Wiklak, "My heart aches every time I go to kitchen and open the refrigerator, imagining my son inside it. It triggers a burst of screams and tears. I even asked my daughter to move the refrigerator outside the house." We call upon member states to take immediate measures to stop this unlawful practice and exert pressure to Israel to return the withheld bodies on their families, to the families, to end the culture of impunity that Israel enjoys as the occupying power, and to hold it accountable for its unlawful acts to collective punishment against the Palestinian in oPt. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Women's International Zionist Organization. The organization is absent, so we move to the Palestinian Return Center Limited.
Mr. President, members of the UN Human Rights Council, PRC has been deeply concerned
by the tragic consequences of Israel's latest assault on the northern occupied West Bank city of Jenin and its refugee camp, during which at least 10 Palestinians were killed and dozens more injured. The latest Israeli military large-scale raids, which involved missiles and killing and injuring of dozens of civilians in the densely populated refugee camp, is an active ethnic cleansing targeting Palestinian people and their homeland. The UNHRC should take urgent action in response to increasing Israeli crimes and settler terrorism across the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel should be held accountable for its mass killings, which make part of a collective punishment tactic by targeting defenseless civilians in such barbaric way. The Israeli occupation is committing once again apartheid and terrorism practices and continues to turn its back on the provisions of the international law and international legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Defense for Children International.
Mr. Vice President, while just a superficial review of the detention of Palestinian children in the Israeli military court system suggests severe risks of arbitrary deprivation of liberty, what emerges from a full view through the experience of Palestinian child detainees is an inherently unjust system of control where arbitrary detention is the default practice. DCI Palestine collected affidavits from 766 West Bank children detained between 2016 and 2022 that show 3/4 of them endured some form of physical violence following arrest. Israeli forces did not inform the children of the reason of their arrest in 85% of the cases. Interrogators used position abuse, threats, and isolation to coerce confessions from some of these children. DCI Palestine documented 178 Palestinian boys held in solitary confinement for an average period of 16.5 days. Under Israeli military law, Palestinian child detainees have no right to a lawyer during interrogation. Israeli military court judges seldom exclude confessions obtained by coercion or torture, even those drafted in Hebrew, a language that most Palestinian children do not understand. Military prosecutors rely sometimes solely on these confessions to obtain a conviction. The deprivation of liberty experienced by Palestinian children in the Israeli military court system is arbitrary by default because Israeli authorities systematically disregard and deny fundamental guarantees concerning the right to a fair trial, to the extent that nearly any deprivation of liberty as part of the military court system is of an arbitrary character. From the widespread ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children to the systematic denial of their due process rights, emerges a system of control that masquerades as justice where arbitrary detention is the default policy. I thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate for this dialogue. I now give the floor back to Ms. Francesca Albanese for her concluding remarks. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vice President, and I would like to thank all the distinguished delegates and members of the civil society who took the floor, who raised their concerns, who echoed my findings, conclusions, and recommendations, also those who expressed criticism. I particularly appreciate the fact that some of you acknowledged the challenges my mandate faces, and particularly in accessing the occupied Palestinian territory, something that has been impeded to this mandate since 2008, and I intend to pursue, because this is one essential prerogative of my work. I will try to have some remarks that address the points many of you raised, referring particularly to the fact that the situation needs to de-escalate. The situation on the ground is not sustainable. That I think that whatever position you might take vis-à-vis Israel and Palestine, you might not see eye to eye on this issue to other members of this council. But it seems to me that everyone agrees that there should be peace, and peace is not pursuable without a firm intervention of the international community, which is you, not me. So it's necessary for me to remind each of you that international law is there to be respected and not to be taken as a menu à la carte, where you can pick and choose which norms to apply and to whom to apply, because by doing that you are eroding the very system that this respectable institution represents, and you are creating privileges where 75 years ago the international community that we are part of today called human rights. They are for all, not for a selected group of people. I decided to focus on the question of incarceration because it's massive, because it erodes the very basis of ensuring and progressing toward peace. The Palestinians live in an environment which is coercive, where they are suffocated, and not just by the way the laws, military orders, martial rule they've been under for 56 years is applied to them. I underlined that the occupation has transformed the occupied Palestinian territory in a panopticon and a constantly surveilled prison, and it has done so since the very beginning of the occupation under the pretense of security. There is one human rights and international humanitarian law provision that, if respected, would have avoided all this, and it's Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, which is in one provision aims to prevent colonization. That provision which prohibits the transfer of civilian population in occupied territory, and with it the forcible displacement of protected persons outside the occupied territory, was intended to preserve the integrity of a territory and the rights of its people under occupation. And this is what Israel has been allowed to pursue within 56 years. The taking of land, the confiscation of private land, the demolition of houses, the forced evictions, the arbitrary arrests and including of children, or the violence that you have seen this year in Palestinian villages or in refugee camps. This is not something accidental or that results out of the upsurge of violence out of nothing. This is a continuity of structural violence that is inherent to the nature of the occupation that Israel has put in place in the occupied territory. And again, I reiterate, I do not condone and I do condemn acts of violence by anyone, including Palestinians, especially when they target civilians. But at the same time, in order to address this, we need to address the root causes, which is an occupation that operates since 1967 outside of what is permitted under international law. To get out of this situation, there is only one peaceful way, which is a paradigm shift. The international community must change the way it looks at the question of Palestine, the way it approaches it, and the way it deals with what it calls the parties. Although I challenge this language, because there are no parties. There is, as I said before, one occupier, one occupying power, and one other people, which is protected under international law. Applying international law means first and foremost recognizing the illegality, the underpinning illegality of the situation that is maintained in the occupied Palestinian territory. Every member state in this room has the responsibility not to recognize as legal, not to recognize the consequences of the occupation that Israel maintains and its apartheid system imposed on the Palestinians. I've identified a number of conducts that might amount to crimes prosecutable under the Rome Statute. These have to be investigated, both or either by the International Criminal Court or by national jurisdictions, and this is something that is accessible to all of you. The other important corollary of it is that the cessation of the illegal situation and reparations must be assured. There are three practical recommendations that I addressed to the State of Israel, and I hope that are followed up as an initial step to undo decades of arbitrary deprivation of liberty, the declaration of a moratorium on the detention of minors, the release of every Palestinian, including children who are detained for acts devoid of offensiveness under international law. So not anyone who has committed acts that might be under international law considered act of terrorism. But again, this is not a majority at all of those who are detained in Israeli prisons. And release all the withheld bodies of deceased Palestinians, ensuring dignified burials. I urge you to use all diplomatic, political and economic measures afforded by the Charter of the United Nations without discrimination. And last but not least, ensure protection. The Palestinians at this moment face an existential threat, and they need protection by the international community because they are defenseless. This is the reality. And if they resort to violence, this is a desperate act that shouldn't be condoned, but can be resolved by addressing again the root causes. And before concluding, I register the concern raised by certain among you concerning my alleged bias. I do see that those who made these comments have left the room. I'm sorry about that. But I reiterate, it's 1 year and a half that I get accused of anti-Semitism and bias, and I still fail to see what in my reports actually is biased, because my job as a special rapporteur is to investigate with objectivity and impartiality the situation on the ground, after which I make recommendations and conclusions and recommendations. The fact that under the pretense of advancing human rights, certain organizations use this platform to denigrate and demonize the work of human rights defenders, including myself and the distinguished predecessors who held this mandate before me, warrants change, as it betrays the very mission and purpose, again, of this esteemed institution. And let me go to the bias. This year, actually, since the beginning of my mandate, I've borne witness to a series of deeply distressing events. 420,000 Palestinians, including 91 children, and 56 Israelis, including 5 children, have been killed. A significant number of the Israeli casualties were soldiers or armed settlers. 9,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned, including those defending themselves, like the farmers who oppose the evictions from their lands. And this happens while soldiers and settlers roam around the occupied Palestinian territory, free to terrorize and brutalize the Palestinians. Two full-on offensives have been launched against the Gaza Strip, both devoid of military necessity and characterized by disproportionate and deliberate use of force, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructures. And in the same breath I condemned these, I also condemned the indiscriminate attacks that have resulted from the launch of missiles. So, where is the bias? This is the situation. It's so unequal, so disproportionate, that there is no way to interpret this mandate without expressing incredible concern for the double standards that are continue to be, for the double standards that the international community continues Israel to enjoy. So I forgive these organizations who have spent 1 year and a half slandering myself as a persona and as a mandate, and I encourage you to work together for a place where the human rights of all, both Israelis and Palestinians, are upheld and respected.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank Ms. Francesca Albanese for her participation today. At this stage, there appears to be no request for rights of reply. May I once again ask, is there any delegation requesting to exercise the right of reply in relation to the statements made in this item? I see none. With this last intervention, we have therefore concluded the consideration of agenda item 7. We will take a small